I have told myself over the years that what I did was simply the right thing to do. That a man of my position who witnessed a wrong and had the means to quietly correct it was obliged to act. That it was no different from paying a tenant's physician or settling a debt incurred by negligence on the estate. A practical matter, a matter of honor, not personal. I have told myself this so many times that for a while I almost believed it. My name is Edric Varn. I am the Duke of Varnholm, and I have been a fool for 4 years in the most private and carefully concealed way imaginable. This is the account of how I was found out, not by society, not by my secretary, not by any of the dozen people who might have noticed what I was doing and what it meant, but by her. By Marin Ashby herself, in a stone-floored schoolroom on the edge of the Yorkshire moors, on a Tuesday afternoon in January when the light was already failing, and I had no good reason to be standing in her doorway. I will try to be accurate. I owe her that at least. It began at Selverton House, which belonged to my sister Dorothea and her husband, Sir Clement Roe. I had arrived on a Thursday to settle some matter of a shared trust that Clement could not be trusted to settle alone, and because Dorothea had insisted, and because I had no compelling reason to refuse. I was 31. I had been Duke for 6 years. I was considered, by those who kept such accounts, to be cold, deliberate, and not particularly interested in the social functions of my rank, which was accurate, and which I did not consider a failing. Selverton House was a pleasant enough property in the Berkshire countryside, and Dorothea ran it efficiently. She had 2 children by then, a boy of 4 and a girl of nearly 7, and both of them were looked after by a governess whose name I had been told at some point but had not retained. I was not in those years greatly interested in the domestic arrangements of other people's households. I met Marin Ashby on the Friday morning. I had come down early, before Dorothea and Clement were about, and had taken my coffee in the small morning room that faced the east garden. I was reading dispatches from my steward at Varnholm when the door opened, and a young woman came in, realized someone was already there, and stopped. She said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I did not know the room was occupied. I'll take the children to the blue sitting room." 2 small children were behind her, the boy gripping her hand, the girl already retreating. The young woman was perhaps 25, simply dressed, with brown hair arranged neatly and an expression that managed, quite naturally, to be neither servile nor presumptuous. She looked at me the way one looks at an inconvenience one is perfectly capable of managing. I said there was no need for her to go. I said so because the morning room was large, and I was only in one corner of it, and because, displacing 3 people from a room I had no particular claim on struck me as unnecessary. She thanked me quietly, and settled the children at the far table with a picture book and some drawing things, and then she sat beside them and did not look at me again. I found I was not reading the dispatches. This is not the sort of thing I admit easily. I am not a man given to distraction. My secretary had once told a mutual acquaintance that I had the concentration of a man who found other people mildly theoretical, which I thought was a fair assessment, and which I did not attempt to correct. But I sat in that morning room for 40 minutes, and I read the same paragraph of my steward's report 4 times, and I was aware, in some peripheral way I could not entirely account for, of Marin Ashby helping a small boy copy the letter G in a style that apparently required considerable encouragement. I left when the children grew restless, and I told myself nothing about it. I saw her twice more over that visit, once at dinner, where she ate with the children and the housekeeper rather than the family, and once in the hallway when she was carrying an armload of books upstairs and I was coming down. She stood aside to let me pass. I said good evening. She said good evening. That was all. I returned to Varnholm the following Monday and resumed my life. 6 weeks later, I received a letter from Dorothea informing me that she had let Miss Ashby go. I read the letter twice. Dorothea's explanation was brief and uninformative. The arrangement had not suited, and she had found a new woman, very highly recommended, and really it was all for the best. I was familiar with this style of letter from my sister. It was the style she used when she had done something she expected me to disapprove of but had no intention of reconsidering. I wrote back and asked what had happened. Her reply took 10 days and said, "The woman had been too independent in her manner, and Clement felt the children were being encouraged toward opinions unsuitable for their station, and really the new governess was excellent, and there was no need to concern myself." I set the letter down and sat for a while in my study at Varnholm. Too independent in her manner. This was Clement's language. Clement was a man who found any evidence of a woman possessing a considered opinion to be a form of insubordination. I had known this about him when Dorothea married him, and had said as much to Dorothea, who had told me I was being difficult, and who had married him anyway. It was one of the defining patterns of my relationship with my sister. The governess, dismissed without cause by a man who disliked her self-possession, would now require a new position. She had been at Selverton 18 months, long enough that her character reference from Dorothea would be essential and long enough that a poor one, or, worse, an absent one, would close a number of doors. I told myself that this was what concerned me, the injustice of it, the practical consequence of a woman being dismissed on a pretext, because her employer was a small man with a low tolerance for competence. I wrote to my man of business in London, a very capable and very discreet individual named Prentice, and I asked him to make some inquiries. It took Prentice 11 days to discover that Miss Maren Ashby, formerly governess to the Rowe household, had been declined by 3 families in Berkshire. Clement had spoken to the right people, and was now being considered for a position in Wiltshire with a family called Dunning, whose household was, according to Prentice's discreet inquiries, a difficult one, a mistress with a volatile temper and a habit of finding fault, and a record of retaining governesses for less than a season. I told Prentice to write a character reference for Miss Ashby on behalf of a former employer, using a name that would not be traced back to me. Prentice, who had been in my service for 9 years, asked no questions. He wrote the reference. He did not use my name. He used the name of a respected widow in Buckinghamshire who had, several years prior, employed a governess for her grandchildren, and who had since died, and whose household records were not available for inspection. It was not an honest reference. I was aware of this. I told myself it was corrective, that it simply restored a balance that Clement had tipped. The Dunning position did not materialize. There were others, and each time Prentice reported the outcome, declined, the family went a different direction. The post had been filled. I felt a particular quality of attention I did not examine. In March, Prentice sent word that Miss Ashby had made inquiries about a schoolmistress position in the north of England, in a village in the West Riding of Yorkshire, administered through a charitable trust. The salary was modest. The post required her to travel at some expense. The position was, by Prentice's assessment, a good one, stable, respectable, a small school with a reliable committee of governors who did not interfere. But the coach fare north and the necessary lodgings while she established herself would cost more than she likely had. I asked Prentice to arrange the payment of her coach fare, anonymously, through a charity account I kept for estate dependents. I asked him to arrange that her first 3 months of lodgings in the village of Crail were secured through the same account. I told him the money was to reach her as a bursary from the charitable trust itself, and that she was not to know its origin. Prentice arranged it. She went north, she took the position. I told myself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. I should say, in fairness to myself, that there was a gap of 8 months in which I did nothing. I received quarterly reports from Prentice as a matter of habit, and the reports confirmed that Miss Ashby was settled in Crail, that the school was going well, and that she appeared to be regarded with some warmth by the village. I read these reports and filed them. I did not act on them. I did not, during this period, send further funds or make any further arrangement. I genuinely believed for those 8 months that the matter was concluded. Then Prentice wrote to me in November of that first year to say that Miss Ashby had taken ill during an outbreak of fever in the village, and that the doctor's fees were beyond what her salary readily accommodated, and that she had, according to his sources, written to her sister in Bristol asking for a small loan. I sat with that letter for a long time. The fever was not grave, Prentice said. She would recover, but the costs were not trivial, and the loan from her sister might take weeks to arrive, and in the meantime she was managing. I told myself I would wait and see. I waited 4 days. Then I asked Prentice to arrange for the doctor's fees to be settled anonymously, through the charitable trust account, described as a welfare disbursement for a community educator. She recovered. The fees were settled. Her sister's letter arrived 10 days later and was apparently not needed. This happened 3 times over the following years, not illness each time, but circumstances. A necessary repair to the schoolroom roof that the trust committee was slow to fund. The cost of books she had ordered with her own money because the committee's allocation had run out. A period of 3 weeks one winter when the roads were impassable, and she was effectively stranded in Crail without deliveries, and the village was short of provisions, and I paid for a supply cart to come up from the south, and I made sure the arrangement was described as an estate welfare measure for isolated communities in the West Riding, which it technically was. I was never dishonest with myself about what I was doing. I knew, by the second year, that I was doing it because I thought about her. I knew that when Prentice's quarterly reports arrived, I read them before anything else on my desk. I knew that I had an entirely clear picture in my mind of a stone schoolroom in a village I had never visited, with a woman in it who did not know I existed in any particular way. I did not call this love. I told myself it was concern, the concern of a man who had observed an injustice and felt responsible for its correction, extended a little further than strictly necessary by temperament. I was 34. I had been managing the Varnholm estates for 9 years. I was not, by any measure, an impractical man. I was aware that telling oneself a thing is not the same as its being true. I simply did not examine it. In December of the 4th year, my steward at Crail wrote to me about a matter of fencing on the moorland boundary, a dispute with a neighboring farmer that had dragged on for 2 seasons and required my personal attention, or at least my personal instruction. I had a small estate in the West Riding, Crail Grange, that I had inherited with the title and visited rarely. It was managed by a reliable steward named Haverford, who was thorough and almost never requested my presence. When he requested it, I went. I told myself the timing was coincidental. I arrived at Crail Grange on a Wednesday evening in January, when the moors were gray and the light was already gone by 4 o'clock, and the roads north of the village were half frozen. Haverford met me at the door and gave me his account of the fencing dispute, which was straightforward and would be resolved in a morning. He told me about the village. He mentioned that the school had done well under its current mistress, who was well regarded. He said her name. I said, in a tone I kept carefully level, that I was glad to hear it. The next morning, after I had spoken with the farmer about the boundary and the matter was settled, it took, as I had predicted, less than an hour. I walked into the village. I did not go to the school. I had no reason to go to the school. I walked past it. It was a single-story building of Yorkshire stone, set beside the churchyard, with 2 long windows and a door that stood partly open despite the cold. From inside I could hear voices, children's voices, and then a woman's voice, clear and unhurried, asking a question about something I couldn't quite make out from the lane. I stood there for what I hope was a brief time, and then walked back to the Grange. I told Haverford I would stay another day to review the drainage accounts. He looked at me with the polite neutrality of a man who has worked for me long enough to know when I am explaining myself unnecessarily, and he said he would have the accounts ready after supper. The second morning, I went to the school. I had a reason by then. I had, during the evening, recalled that the Varnholm Charitable Trust had a standard practice of periodic site visits for any institution it supported, not frequent, perhaps every few years, but legitimate. The Crail Schoolroom Trust was, on paper, a minor beneficiary of the estate's welfare account. It was not unusual for a visiting trustee to call in. This is what I told myself. I knocked at the door. She opened it. I had not, in 4 years, arrived at any particular settled image of what Marin Ashby would look like in the context of this life she had built. I had Prentice's reports, which were factual and not descriptive. I had the memory of 3 brief encounters at Selverton House, which I had apparently retained more precisely than I had admitted, because when she opened the door I recognized her immediately. The steady gray eyes, the composed expression, the slight economy of movement that suggested a person who did not expend energy on things that didn't require it. She had been a composed young woman at 25. She was a composed woman of 29, and the composure had settled more deeply into her, the way a house settles into its foundations over time and becomes harder to shift. She did not recognize me. Why should she? She had seen me twice at Selverton House and spoken 4 sentences to me. She said, "Good morning, can I help you?" I introduced myself. I said I was Edric Varn, and that I was visiting Crail Grange on estate business, and that as the estate maintained a connection to the schoolroom trust, I thought I would call in, if it was not inconvenient. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not entirely read, not suspicious exactly, but attentive in the way of someone filing information away. Then she stood back from the door and said it was not inconvenient at all, and invited me in. The schoolroom was as I had imagined it, more or less, long and stone-floored, with the windows on the south wall. 8 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. A blackboard at the far end with a grammar exercise written on it. The room smelled of chalk dust, and the pine resin from a small stove in the corner that was doing its reasonable best against the January cold. The children looked at me with varying degrees of curiosity. Miss Ashby introduced me as a visitor from the estate trust, and told them to continue with their copywork, and then led me to the far end of the room where we could speak without interrupting them. She was straightforward about the school's situation. She told me the enrollment had grown from 6 to 10 students over 3 years, and that she expected another 2 in the spring. She told me about the curriculum, which was practical and well considered. She told me the committee had been responsive mostly, and that the roof repair the previous autumn had solved the water problem. She said the trust's bursary in the first year had made the difference between the school being viable and not, and that she was grateful for it, and that she hoped the trust understood the value of what it was supporting. I said I believed it did. She looked at me steadily while she said all of this, and I was aware that she was assessing me, not in a manner that was rude, but in the manner of someone who had learned that it was necessary to understand exactly who one was speaking to before trusting the conversation. I asked if I could see the record books. She went and retrieved them. I sat at the table near the window and looked at them while she returned to the children. The record books were meticulous. Every student's attendance, progress, and particular difficulties noted in a precise hand that I had seen before. It was the same hand as the annual report she submitted to the trust, which Prentice forwarded to me and which I read every year, before anything else in the morning's correspondence. I sat with the record books for perhaps 20 minutes. Then I thanked her and said the trust would be pleased with the report, and I said good morning and I left. I walked back to the Grange and told Haverford I needed one more day. He arranged it without comment. She saw me the next day in the lane, quite by accident. I had walked out across the moorland in the afternoon. It was the sort of cold that clarifies thinking, or at least depletes the energy required for dishonesty. And I was coming back through the village when she came out of the post office with a parcel under her arm and nearly walked into me. She said, "Oh, Your Grace, I beg your pardon." I said there was no need to beg anything. There was a moment that lasted perhaps 3 seconds longer than was strictly necessary for two people who had met professionally the previous morning and had nothing particular to say to one another. Then she said the day was very cold, and I agreed that it was, and she said she hoped the estate records had been satisfactory, and I said they had been excellent, and then neither of us said anything. She had a way of being silent that was not uncomfortable. This is not as common as one might imagine. Most people fill silence with something: apology, social noises, questions asked not because one wants the answer, but because silence feels like an indictment. She stood in the lane with her parcel and her steady gray eyes, and did not appear to feel that the silence required managing. I said before I had decided to, that I had been at Selverton House several years ago, that I was Dorothea Rowe's brother. I watched her face. She said after a moment, "Yes, I thought I recognized you." I said I had wondered. She said, "I wasn't certain until just now." Then she thanked me, with a quality of composure that cost her something. I could see it cost her something, for whatever role the trust had played in her first year in Crail. She said the bursary had come at precisely the right moment. She said she had been grateful ever since. I said I was glad the trust had been of use. She looked at me then in the particular way she had looked at me the previous morning, filing and assessing, and she said she hoped she would see me before I left, and that if I had any further questions about the school she was available, and then she said good afternoon and walked away up the lane. I stood in the cold and watched her go and understood, with the clarity that cold air apparently provides, that I was not going to leave Crail the next day. I told Haverford the drainage review was more complex than anticipated, and that I required a week. She did not seek me out, and I did not seek her. We encountered each other with the regularity that a small village produces, at the post office, at the edge of the churchyard when I was walking and she was walking, once at the inn where I was dining, and where she had come to speak with the innkeeper's wife about the children's Christmas pageant. Each time we spoke for a few minutes. Each time the conversation was ordinary and without any quality that an observer would have noted. I noted everything. On the 4th day of the 2nd week, I had extended the stay again, on grounds that Haverford accepted with increasing serenity. She invited me to take tea at the schoolroom after the children had gone home. She said the committee chairman was coming to discuss the spring enrollment, and that as a trust representative it might be useful for me to hear his report. The committee chairman was a reliable man named Sutcliffe, who kept his report to 12 minutes and then excused himself because his wife was expecting him. After he left, Marin put the kettle on again, and we sat at the table by the south windows in the fading afternoon light, and she poured tea, and there was no committee business left to discuss. She said after a while, "You've been here longer than an estate visit usually takes." I said the drainage question had been more complex than first appeared. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. Mr. Haverford said the drainage was settled in the first 3 days. There was a pause. I said that Haverford was very efficient. She set her cup down. She had a way of setting things down, a cup, a book, a pen, that indicated she was about to give the matter at hand her full attention. She said, "You knew who I was before you came to the school, didn't you?" It was not entirely a question. I said yes. She said, "And the bursary in my first year here. The coach fare north." She said it quietly, without accusation, but with the precision of someone who had been thinking about something for several days. I wrote to the trust secretary twice to ask about the fund, and both times the reply was vague, the kind of vagueness that is deliberate. I held her gaze. Yes. She did not speak immediately. The stove ticked in the corner. Outside, the light was going fast from the moors, the gray pulling down into dark. She said, "Why?" Not how or when or who arranged it. Why? I said, "Because Clement Rowe dismissed you without cause, and then spoke against you to people who would listen to him. And you were competent, and you were treated badly, and the result of that would have been worse than Crail." She said, "And you felt responsible." I said, "I felt," and then I stopped, because I had arrived at the place I had been approaching for 4 years with the careful patience of a man who hoped never to arrive there, and the sentence required an ending I had not prepared. She waited. I said I felt that I could correct it, so I did. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said quietly, "That's not quite all of it, is it?" The room was very still. I said no. She rose and went to the window. The moors were dark now, or nearly, just the last seam of gray light along the western edge. She stood with her back to me, looking out. She said without turning, "I have thought this past week about what it means that you knew, that you were at Selverton House and you saw what Clement did and you—" She stopped. Then, "It's a strange thing to discover, that one's life has been not arranged but steadied by someone who didn't say so." I said, "I know it was not entirely honest." She turned from the window. "Was any of it dishonest except the secrecy?" I thought about it. "No, the school is good, the bursary was real, the letter of character that was less honest, the source was fabricated." She said, "To overcome what Clement told people." Yes. She looked at me with that expression that had cost her something, the first time I had seen it. It cost her something now too, but differently. She said, "I've been managing this past week, something I didn't expect to have to manage. The knowledge that I was not, as I believed, entirely self-made." I said carefully, "You built the school, you kept the records. You found the students and learned their names and stayed through 2 winters when you might have gone south to something easier. That was entirely you. But the foundation was not laid by you, I know." I paused. "I am sorry for that part of it, I am not sorry for the rest." She stood across the room from me and looked at me steadily. "Are you not?" "No." Another silence, of the particular quality that only occurs when 2 people are standing on the edge of something, and both of them know it. She said, "When you came to the door on Wednesday morning and introduced yourself as a trust representative, was that the first time you had thought of coming here?" I said it was not. She said, "How long had you thought of it?" I said, "Rather longer than was good sense." Something crossed her expression then, not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. She said, "You are very precise about almost everything, and then you are very imprecise about this." I said that was accurate. She crossed the room, not quickly, and sat down at the table again. Not across from me, beside me, angled slightly, as though the geography of the room had rearranged itself a little. She said, "What I am trying to establish, because I am someone who needs to understand the thing clearly before I can proceed, is whether you came here because of the estate business, or because of me." I said the estate business was real. It was also not the reason. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already calculated. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at me. She said, "I am a schoolmistress in a village in the West Riding. I have £37 saved, and a second-hand copy of Johnson's dictionary that I value considerably. I am not," she paused, searching for the word, "a plausible direction for a duke." I said, "I am 35 years old, and I have been a duke since I was 25, and I have found very little about the position that interested me more than the question of how you were getting on." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is a remarkable thing to say." I said, "It is true." She looked at me for a long time. The stove had settled lower, and the room was darker, and I could see her very clearly, the steady gray eyes, the composure that was not coldness but was instead the hardened form of a great deal of quiet endurance, and beneath it something that was not composed at all but was present and careful and alive. She said, "I think I need to sleep on this." I said, "Of course." She said, "I think you should come back tomorrow." I said I would. I did not sleep well. This is not remarkable. I am not given to sleeplessness as a rule, but there is a particular quality of wakefulness that comes when one has said a true thing aloud for the first time and cannot put it back. I lay in the dark at Crail Grange and looked at the ceiling and went over the conversation in the way one goes over a piece of ground one has traversed for the first time, checking for what one missed. What I turned over most was the moment she had said, "I have been managing, this past week, something I didn't expect to have to manage." The knowledge that I was not, as I believed, entirely self-made. This had troubled me since she said it, and it troubled me now more than anything else in the evening's reckoning. I had told myself over 4 years that what I was doing was corrective, restorative, that I was restoring a balance Clement had destroyed, and that once the balance was restored, the work was mine and what she did with it was hers. I had believed, and not dishonestly, that what I was protecting was her agency, her ability to build a life on her own terms. But the terms were not entirely her own, and she knew it now. I had been very careful, for 4 years, not to be a patron, not to be the kind of man who arranges a woman's life for her and calls it benevolence. And yet I had, in certain structural ways, done precisely that, arranged the conditions under which she was free, without telling her those conditions existed. There is a philosophical problem in this that I did not entirely solve before dawn. What I arrived at, somewhere around 3 in the morning, was this: the wrong I had done her was the secrecy. Not the act itself. I would do it again, the coach fare and the lodgings and the doctor's fees, because the alternative was watching her disappear into a position that would have diminished her, and I could not do that. But the secrecy had taken from her the ability to accept or refuse on her own terms. She had been helped without being asked whether she wanted help, which is a different thing from being helped transparently and choosing to accept. I owed her at minimum the full account. I arrived at the schoolroom at 10 the next morning. The children were at their lessons. She let me in, and we stood at the far end of the room again, speaking quietly while the children copied their geography. I told her everything. Not the 4-year arc in general, the specifics, the character reference and from whom it had nominally come, the 3 additional interventions, the doctor, the roof, the supply cart, the quarterly reports I had received from Prentice and read before anything else. She listened with her hands folded in front of her and her expression composed, and I watched her absorb each piece of it. When I was finished, she said, after a moment, "The supply cart in the winter of the 2nd year. I thought that was the estate welfare scheme." I said it was described as such. She said, "Because it came from your estate." "Yes." She breathed out slowly, not in anger or not primarily in anger, but in the manner of someone recalculating. She said, "And the doctor?" "Yes." The committee told me that was a welfare disbursement. It was technically. She looked at me. "You are very good at technically." I said, "I know." She turned away for a moment, looked at the children. They were studiously not looking at us, which meant they were listening, and then she said quietly, "Come outside." We stood in the churchyard in the cold. The graves around us were old, the inscriptions worn flat by weather, and the moors rose gray and enormous to the north. She stood with her arms folded against the cold, looking at the middle distance. She said, "4 years." "Yes." She said, "Did you think about stopping, at any point?" I said I thought about it. I told myself each time that this was the last time. She glanced at me. Something in her expression, the first softening of it I had seen that morning, which had been a controlled and focused morning. She said, "And then you didn't stop." "No." She looked back at the moors. She said, "I'm trying to decide how to feel about this. I had thought before yesterday, before the last week, that I had made this life. That what happened at Selverton House was a thing that happened, and then I came north and I built something. And that was mine." I said, "It is yours, the school is yours, what you made of it is yours." "But the beginning of it was partly mine." "Yes." I paused. "I don't know how to say sorry for that in a way that doesn't ask you to say it doesn't matter, because it does matter. You had a right to know. I took that from you." She was quiet. I said, "If it helps to be angry, I think that's fair." She said, "I'm not angry." A pause. "I'm unsettled. It is uncomfortable to be unsettled. I do not generally allow myself to be unsettled." I said carefully, "I've noticed." She turned to look at me, and this time the thing that crossed her expression was something I had not yet seen from her. A kind of helpless amusement that she was clearly not entirely pleased to be feeling. She said, "This is a very strange situation." I said, "I know." She said, "You are a duke." I said, "I am." She said, "And you have been watching over me, from a distance, for 4 years without telling me." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "That is either very considerate or very presumptuous." I said, "I think it is both." She almost smiled. Then she contained it, and looked back at the moors, and we stood in the cold for a while in the silence that was not uncomfortable. Eventually she said, "What do you want, Edric?" She used my name. She had not done this before. I did not think she was aware she had done it, but I was. I said, "I want to come back to Crail, not for the estate business, not as a trust representative. I want to come back to Crail because this is where you are, and I have found for 4 years that this is where I want to be." She looked at me. I said, "I'm not asking you to decide anything. I'm telling you what's true. You asked me to be precise, and that's the precise thing." She turned back to face the churchyard. A small wind moved across the graves, stirring the dry grass at the stone's bases. She said, "If you come back, what would that look like?" I said I didn't know exactly, that I imagined it would look like 2 people in a small village in Yorkshire, finding out whether they could be in the same place without me being a duke at all times, and her being a governess at all times, and seeing what was actually there when those things were set aside. She said, "And what do you think is actually there?" I said, "I think you know what I think." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I think I do." She didn't say anything else, and neither did I. But she did not move away, and the cold was very cold. And after a moment she pulled her coat closer and turned and walked back toward the schoolroom door, and held it open, and looked back at me and said, "The children need their midday lesson reviewed. You could stay if you wanted. There's tea." I said, "Thank you." She held my gaze for one moment, a particular quality of a held gaze, the kind that carries something unspoken, and is not yet ready to speak it, but is not unwilling either. And then she turned and went inside. I followed her. I stayed in Crail 3 more days. On the second morning I walked with her to the post office, and on the way back she told me about the school's first year, the enrollment of 6, one of whom had been so afraid of the schoolroom that he had cried every morning for a fortnight, and what she had done about it, which was to let him bring a dog. The committee had objected. She had ignored them. The boy was now 9 and had read his way through 2/3 of her bookshelves. I told her about Varnholm. Not the title or the duties, those were not, I thought, the thing she was asking about when she asked. I told her about the north wing, which I had always preferred, because it faced the moors and was cold in winter, and the light in the mornings came in very early and clean. I told her about the library, which had not been properly organized since my grandfather's time, and which I had been meaning to address for 6 years. I told her that the estate had 4 villages, and that the people in them were, by and large, good people who managed difficult circumstances with more grace than they were given credit for. She listened in the way she listened to everything fully, without the performance of listening. On the third morning, I said goodbye to Haverford, who shook my hand with the expression of a man whose relief at my departure was tempered by a suspicion that I would be back. I said I would likely be back in the spring to review the summer drainage estimates. He said he would have the accounts ready. I went to the schoolroom before I took the road south. The children were at their lessons. She came to the door. I said I would write if that was acceptable. She said it was. I said I would come back in the spring. She said, I know. She said it without coyness, without calculation, with the plainness of a woman who had decided something and was not going to pretend she hadn't. I said, Marin. She looked at me. I said, thank you for the way you heard it, all of it. She said quietly, thank you for telling me all of it. We stood at the door of the schoolroom in the January cold, and I think we were both aware that we were standing on one side of a thing and that the other side was different, and that there was no particular hurry, and that there did not need to be. She stepped back inside. I went to the road. I wrote to her in February, and in March she wrote back. Her letters were like her speech, direct, unhurried, precise where precision was useful and warm where warmth was called for. She told me about the school, the new students, the committee's ongoing and apparently inexhaustible capacity for bureaucratic caution. She told me about the moors in February, which she said were either magnificent or terrible depending on the weather, and that she had decided to find them magnificent regardless. She told me the boy with the dog had finished her copy of Robinson Crusoe and had opinions about it that she thought were largely correct. I told her about the north wing and the library and the drainage accounts and a dispute between two tenant farmers about a shared well that had required 3 meetings and a map, and my considered opinion on the depth of a geological stratum, which I had delivered with complete authority and roughly 40% actual knowledge. She wrote back that she hoped the well was satisfied, and that she admired confident ignorance in a man who knew how to deploy it carefully. I read this letter 4 times. I kept it. In April I came back to Crail. The moors in April were extraordinary. All that gray stone country suddenly broken through with color, the heather not yet but the gorse already, and the light so different from January that it seemed like a different place. I arrived on a Tuesday and Haverford met me, and told me the drainage estimates were ready, and also that the schoolmistress had asked whether the Duke was expected this week. I said she had she? He said she had left a message with the housekeeper that there would be tea available at the schoolroom after lessons on Wednesday and Thursday, if that was useful for trust business. I said that sounded useful. He agreed that it did. In April she showed me the moors herself, on Sunday, when the school was closed and the committee was not meeting, and we were 2 people with an afternoon and no particular obligations. We walked north from the village along a track that had been a droving road 300 years ago, and that she had learned from one of the older farmers. The landscape unfolded around us in the particular way of moorland, which does not reveal itself incrementally but simply opens, all at once, into something enormous. She walked without self-consciousness about the pace or the distance or whether her boots were sensible. They were sensible, and she pointed out things I would not have known to look at. A particular configuration of stones that the farmers knew meant a frost risk even in May, the way the birds behaved differently over the wet ground, a fold in the hill that she had thought was one feature and then found was 2. She had learned this country. She had come here not knowing it, and she had learned it, the way she learned everything, by paying attention. I said, at some point while we were standing on a rise above the valley, looking north toward the higher ground, I owe you a better explanation than I gave you in January. She looked at me. Of what? I said, of why You asked me why in the schoolroom, and I told you about Clement and about the injustice of it. That was true. It wasn't all of it. The wind moved through the heather, or what would be heather in another month. Now it was just the dark wood of the stems, the ground brown and deep. She said, I know it wasn't all of it. I said, I noticed you, at Selverton House, in the morning room and in the hallway, 3 encounters that should not have mattered in any particular way, and yet they did. She was looking at the horizon. She said, I noticed you too. This surprised me enough that I said nothing for a moment. She said, you read the same paragraph 4 times, in the morning room. I noticed because I was watching, and you had the manner of someone who was not reading. I said, I was not reading. She glanced at me, the amusement again, the helpless kind that she could not quite contain. She said, I thought you were very strange. A duke in the morning room, not reading, watching children learn to write the letter G. I said, I was not watching the children. She looked at me directly, and I held her gaze, and we were standing on the moors in April, and there was no committee business, and no trust report, and no estate drainage account. And the thing between us that had been nameless for 4 years and accumulating and very careful had nowhere left to be careful, because we were already standing in it. I said, I think I have been in love with you since the morning room at Selverton House, and I told myself for 4 years that I wasn't, and I was wrong. She was quiet. I said, that is the precise thing. She turned away just slightly, looking out at the valley below us. Her profile against the gray sky was very still. She said, after a long moment, I have been trying to decide whether what I feel is the natural result of someone being unexpectedly kind to me over a long time, or whether it is something else. I said, what do you think it is? She said, I think it is something else. The wind came across the moor, and I did not move toward her, and she did not move toward me because neither of us was the sort of person who moved without being certain, and we were not yet entirely certain, or perhaps we were certain, but we were being careful with the certainty in the way one is careful with things that matter. She said, you should know that I will not be arranged. I said, I know. She said, and that I will continue to run the school as long as I choose to, regardless of any other arrangement. I said, of course. She said, and that I have £37 and a copy of Johnson's dictionary, and I will not be, she paused, searching for the word again, absorbed. I said, I would not want you to be. She said, good. A pause. Then I think you may come back to Crail as many times as you like, and it will not be for trust business. I said, no. She turned to look at me. The gray eyes, the composure that was not hiding anything now but was simply itself, the settled form of a great deal of endurance, and a great deal of quietly applied intelligence, and a great deal of love that had not been named but had been there, I thought, for longer than either of us had been strictly honest about. She said, you should write more frequently. I said, how frequently? She said, more frequently than you have been. I said I would. She turned back to the valley, and we stood side by side on the droving road with the moors enormous around us and the light changing over the high ground to the north. And after a while she said something about the gorse and I said something back, and we walked down toward Crail together in the ordinary, extraordinary way of 2 people who have arrived at the thing they have been approaching for a very long time, and who intend, quietly and without undue fuss, to stay. I said at the beginning that I had told myself over the years that what I did was simply the right thing, a practical matter, a matter of honor, not personal. I am 35 years old and I am a precise man, and I have the honest assessment of a woman who told me I was very good at technically, and what I know now, standing in the north wing of Varnholm in the early light on a morning in May with her letter on the desk beside me and a journey north already decided. What I know is this. It was personal from the first morning. It was love from before I had any right to call it that, and it was the finest thing I ever did covertly and the most honest thing I ever did when I finally told the truth of it. She did not want to be arranged, and she was right. She did not want to be absorbed, and she was right about that too. What she granted me on the moors in April was not a title or a claim. It was simply the chance to come back. To be present without arrangement. To be, for once, not the Duke of Varnholm managing a situation from a careful and appropriate distance, but only Edric standing beside her in the wind, looking north, hoping she would keep talking. She did. She always does now. And there is no part of my life, not the estates nor the title nor the 10,000 practical obligations of my rank, that I would not trade for an afternoon on the moors above Crail, walking fast because she walks fast, listening to her tell me what she has learned about this country, and knowing, with the certainty of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself, that she is telling me because she wants me there to hear it.